So I just finished another one of my teacher's class, which is my weekly online interactive video call that I've been doing. I've been talking about it in these top of the podcast spots because I want more and more people to find out about it and to get in on it. Tonight, we talked about the coolest stuff. First, we talked about cultural appropriation and whether or not it's okay to chant and to say namaste, and do people do it and do they not do it and why. We also talked about how to choose a teacher training. Someone joined who's not a teacher yet. They've just been practicing a long time and they wanted to find out about how to choose teacher training. So we had some discussion of that. And we also talked about the connection between introception and non-duality. Yup, we talked about that. But more than anything, what people have been finding is that there is a sense of community online where we can really talk about stuff, and podcast listeners get in on the conversations, and I add my 2 cents, as I am oft to do, as you know, and it's just been incredibly rewarding, and you are welcome to join in on it. I want to encourage you to do so. It's the J. Brown Yoga Teachers Class. You can find it at jbrownyoga.com. All right. What do you say? Think we should do this? I mean, you've hit play. I've hit record. So we might as well, right? This is J. Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is J. Brown. I would like to welcome you, especially if you're new, and just say what's up if you're returning. How is everyone this week? I am returned home, and I'm in the studio. I don't feel crunched for time. I don't have hosts on the other side of the door that I'm worried might be hearing me. I have some freedom to be with you this week, which is very nice. I had some wonderful workshops in Virginia. I was mentioning them to you last week. And there's one particular thing that has really been on my mind. It's in my blog post this month. We were just talking about it in my teacher's class this week. And it's from an interaction I had with a fellow teacher over this last weekend. It was like while I was in Virginia. And it triggered something in me. And it's not the first time that I've come to this, but basically a fellow teacher was making a confession to me in an email and admitting that after she teaches a class or after she goes to a class, she's usually in a lot of pain. And bad, like she's rushing to get to the heated seats in her car to ease it, even in the summer. And she was also thanking me because she'd been doing this simpler practice with me via my live stream classes, and she had had several practices where she didn't feel pain after. And it made her realize how much pain she's been in when she's doing these other kind of practices and teaching these other kind of practices. Also, in the workshops I was teaching this weekend, I had several teachers who were in their late 60s and early 70s who seemed to me were in a similar situation where they were demonstrating to me very classical alignment when I would ask them to come to a lunge. And even sometimes when I would encourage them to bring their feet in a little closer, like tell everybody to do that, they weren't. They were like taking these really big stances. And they looked good. They were classical alignment. But in Shavasana, at the end of practice, I could see they were in pain, that their hips were hurting, and they were adjusting, and they were doing things that I recognized from my own body. And I just thought, oh man, like, I know that when I stopped pushing my body so far into those ranges, when I stopped worrying about making my poses look the way that yoga teachers are supposed to look, that's where my pain eased up and I figured some things out for myself. And I just think it's an example of a predicament that we're in, where teachers who are teaching stuff that they no longer are really practicing so much on their own at home. In fact, a lot of yoga teachers don't even have practices that they're doing by themselves at home. They only go to other yoga classes, which I think is a problem in and of itself. If you're a yoga teacher listening to this, I really think you need to have some occasions where you do practice all by yourself without a teacher or a class. I think it's important. And the teachers who do have personal practices that they do very often do something different than what they teach. And the thing that they do for themselves is to heal themselves from the performance of teaching their class. I just want to say to anybody listening to this who's a yoga teacher that if you've got pain, you got to own it. We can't deny the pain or rationalize the pain away. And we have to address it. Those of you who listen for a long time know I had pain issues and I've talked about them. These days I'm doing pretty good. I haven't been talking about my pain issues because I've been managing them very well, but maybe it's a topic that needs to come up again because I just think that a lot of the ways that yoga teachers earn respect are from the way that students perceive them. And if it is the student's perception that an advanced yoga teacher, a good yoga teacher, is the one who can do the shapes in a certain way or look like the pictures they've seen, then teacher's job often is meeting that expectation somehow or, trying to make that appearance, even when it goes against what really serves them. And I don't think we can do that. Maybe if you're just into fitness and you're just a fitness instructor and it happens to be yoga poses, then it doesn't matter. But if you'd like it to be yoga, which I think is more than fitness, that means that we're going to have to be more an example of what we're supposedly teaching. And if it can't work for you personally, then I don't think we should teach it. I think it has to be from our actual experience. It can't be something we just do for the money. It can't be a money gig. Yoga can't be a money gig. So that's what I wanted to say. I just get that off my chest. It's been on my mind. You can email me if you've got responses or thoughts about that. Fortunately, today we have a podcast to listen to with Gary Kraftsow, who couldn't be more an example of a teacher whose teaching is rooted in practice. It's the third in the series of TKV Desikachar episodes that I've been rolling out since the conference that I went to at Kripalu in June, hosted by my friend Leslie Kaminoff. They've been great, haven't they? Well, we've got more, and today's talk is no exception. It was just fantastic to have this opportunity to talk about TKV Desikachar, to talk about Gary's work. And honestly, we get into a bit of some debate on some areas, which I think was fun. And you're going to get to hear it all today. Before we get to it, let me mention that today's episode is sponsored by yoganatomy.net. Do you know what that is? You should. If you don't, it's the online education resource of Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews. They are the co-authors of the well-known book Yoga Anatomy. And I've been talking about them. They've been sponsoring the podcast for a while. They've both been on the podcast before. You should go back and listen to those episodes. They're mind-blowing and totally educational and awesome. I have studied with both Leslie and Amy, and I'm just overjoyed to have them as sponsors. I know their work firsthand. I can totally stand behind it. In fact, if you take Leslie's Principles course online, you will take it alongside me. I was in the group that they filmed for the online course. I ask a million questions, and I just learned so much from him. I cannot recommend them enough. If you need to study yoga anatomy, or if you just want some deep yoga learning, I highly recommend going to yoganatomy.net. For those of you who were listening last week, I mentioned that there was a possibility of adding an additional episode from the TKV Desikachar series. Well, that has happened, my friend. It has been recorded, and I am adding a bonus episode. So there's 2 more after this, and I will tell you who it is on the other side of this talk. Also, if you've been listening to this podcast and you have any interest in meeting me in person, I've got some upcoming gigs. I'm going to be in Rye, New York at Wainwright House, August 26th. I'm going to be in Hamilton, New Jersey at Bamboo Yoga, September 15th. And I'm going to be in Burlington, Vermont at Burlington Yoga, September 22nd and 23rd. You can find out about those gigs and more. You can listen to the archives of this podcast and read my blog. I've got a new one coming out that you might want to check out. You can also find all of my online video stuff, my DVD and download practice videos, my online workshop, Gentle is the New Advanced, my live stream subscription to all of my public classes, and my new weekly teacher's call. You can find out about all of that stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okie dokie. I think that's good. I'm sure many of you are like, all right, already, let's get to this talk with Gary. I'm with you. Let's do it. I will touch base with you on the other side. But now, here we go. Listen to this talk that I had with Gary Kraftsow. Hello?
Hey.
Is this Gary? Oh, there you are. You put your video on. Hold on, I'll put mine on just to say hi. Hi.
Hey. So are we doing video or not?
No, we can turn the video off because we'll get a better audio signal.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So, how are you today?
Thanks for asking. I'm fine. You know, this has been a quiet, a little bit of a quiet summer. Usually, I'm on the road far too often, so this gives me some time to play around with some home projects.
Right. And we're
not being podcast live on this part, are we?
No, I mean I'm recording, but
it's
not going out live. It'll go out live in like a couple of weeks.
Got it. And so you'll start it at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean I probably will cut out a little bit of what just happened, but I'll probably keep most of it. I usually just try to keep it in the spirit of the actual conversation that we're having right now.
I see. So I mean, if you want to say how am I doing or something, we can start over then because I didn't know the structure of this. So
no, that's okay. We're good. We already got a little bit about how you're doing. You had some time to yourself this summer, which I kind of understand. I just got back from some travel, and I have like a month or two as well. So I'm sort of in the same spot.
You know, for me, it's been like 45 years of travel. So I know it's crazy. Time passes. So to get, like a month and a half where I don't have to go anywhere. I mean, I'm obviously engaged in projects at home and also projects for my work. But it's nice to have some of that time just to be home and focus on things here.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Well,
and you're in New York, right?
No, right now I'm in Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
I was in Brooklyn for 10 years. I had a center there, and I was just bunkered down with small children in a yoga center for 10 years. And then I sold it last year, and I moved my family to Pennsylvania, and I've been traveling the last year.
Where in Pennsylvania are you?
Right now I'm at my studio, which is in Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Okay, I grew up in Philadelphia, so...
Oh, okay, so you know the Lehigh Valley. You know, it's funny.
And I was in... Yeah, go on.
No, what were you going to say?
I went to Abington High School, and I lived in Rydal, which is near Jenkintown. And I left Philadelphia when I was 17, and then my family moved to Maui. My parents moved to Maui the year I graduated from college. So I've lived on Maui for 30 years from 1976.
Oh, well, that's interesting because I know you said that often when you talk about like where your yoga started, it starts with religious studies at Colgate University. So
Correct.
That couldn't have been too long after you left Philadelphia.
I left Philadelphia in 1972 and spent 4 years at Colgate, including 6 months in India in that period. So I graduated high school in 1972 and went to Colgate, and then graduated Colgate in 1976 and moved to Maui.
I see. So it was the move to Maui, related to the fact that you had family there, I guess.
My older brother had graduated, several years before me, and went traveling in South America and met a woman from Ojai, California, who, and she was a year older than him. So I'm 63. So she's about 68 now. So she was one of those flower children hippies back in the late 60s, living on the beach in Hawaii. And my brother was traveling in South America and met her. And they fell in love, and they're still married. And so he moved from the East Coast to Maui in 1975, I believe, or 74. And then in 76, we all went out for the wedding. That was the year that I graduated. And my parents said, okay, we're moving to Maui in 1976. And I said, okay, I'm going to India. And I went back to India. I had been there already in 74. And so I went back in 76 for 2 years. And when I returned from those 2 years in India, Maui was my home rather than Philadelphia.
I see. Well, it connects to a lot of other conversations I've had in the podcast before. In fact, I talked with Richard Miller yesterday. That'll post before this one. And he also grew up in the area in the Lehigh Valley, I heard. You two both from a similar area. Did you know that?
That's interesting. I've known Richard for more than almost 2 decades, and I didn't realize he grew up on the East Coast in Pennsylvania. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I discovered that yesterday with him too. And also, I remember when I spoke with Danny Paradise, he spoke about Hawaii as quite a hotbed of yoga at that time, like in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yes, Danny was I was there before Danny, but Danny was a student of David Williams, and David Williams was one of the very first Ashtanga teachers. And I met David Williams in 1976. He was teaching Ashtanga yoga under the banyan tree in Lahaina. And we became friendly, and we maintained a friendship all along, although some of his students didn't appreciate that I wasn't just all excited about Ashtanga yoga, because I had already been in Madras and met Krishnamacharya and Desikachar, and David was a student of Pattabhi Jois. So yes, that scene on Maui began in the mid-'70s, David teaching in Lahaina and me teaching up in Makawao. Uh-huh. And then, I had my private yoga therapy practice in Makawao, and David was starting that Ashtanga movement in Hawaii, and there was a big community of Ashtangis. It was quite a hotbed is not the wrong word.
Well, it's interesting to me also, Gary, when I was looking at your bio and stuff, and a lot of people who come on the podcast, I'm always interested, what's the thing that brought you to yoga? And a lot of times people have like a life thing that happened, often like a tragedy or some difficulty that had to be overcome. But it seems to me that you really came to it through an interest in religion or study of religion.
Yes, when I was a kid, I was sort of fascinated with, the meaning of life and death and all of that, and sort of freaked my parents out. And when I was little kid, I was watching David Carradine Kung Fu, and I thought my mom was into Chinese art, so I thought I was, bound for China and some form of Tai Chi or something. And when I went to Colgate, I ended up in a religious studies class, and I took for the phys ed requirement karate class. And it's funny about the way the timing worked. I ended up in a class on Buddhism, or I took a class on Buddhism. Reverse. I took a class on the way the schedule worked out. I took a class on Hinduism, and the phys ed requirement, I took karate. And I really loved the class on Hinduism, but I was not pleased with the karate class.
It wasn't what you thought after watching the show, huh?
Not at all. Well, the guy was a Korean War vet, the teacher, and his energy I wasn't interested in the way he was presenting martial arts, but I loved the the Hinduism class, excuse me. So the next semester I took the Buddhism class and I took the yoga. It's kind of funny how it reversed. I took karate and Buddhism, and then I took karate and Hinduism. I keep making that mistake. And then the Buddhism class, and I took a yoga class that was being offered through the phys ed department. And the teacher was a woman named Mary Lou Skelton, who you heard about now from your meeting at Kripalu, who was a longtime student of Krishnamacharya. And her husband was the chairman of the music department and an ethnomusicologist. And so I met her, and 6 months later, they were bringing a study group of music students to India, to Madras, and they invited me to go. And so I had to do something with music. So I studied mridangam, which is a South Indian two-headed drum, when I was in Madras. This was in 1974. But I really went to meet Krishnamacharya and Desikachar and start my yoga studies. And at the same time, I was set up to do coursework at the religious studies department at Madras University. And there I met, and I got a private tutorial with a guy that turned out to be an incredible, not only an academic, but sort of a well-respected mystic in Shaivite Siddhanta, which is a South Indian tantric Shaivite tradition. So I was studying Shaivism or Shaivite Tantra with Devasanapati at Madras University, and studying yoga with Desikachar primarily, although I met and had conversations with Krishnamacharya, and studying mridangam. That was in 1974. So
let me jump in for a second. I'm curious, why do you think that you had such a predilection toward this from such an early age? Do you have any idea about why that was?
Well, I can tell you what my teacher said when he met me shortly after he got to know me. But by the way, I just want to finish one thing.
Okay.
When I took that Hinduism course, that's when I encountered Patanjali. Yeah. So I had thought, I was very into Lao Tzu, and which is not Buddhism, but I was into Lao Tzu and David Carradine and Kung Fu, and then I ended up in this Hinduism course, and I met Patanjali. And so that's kind of where my interest in yoga was, more the philosophy of yoga. I had been a gymnast in high school. So the physical stuff wasn't that interesting to me. I felt like I didn't know. I was wrong, but I thought at that time that I'd already been there and done that with gymnastics. In any case, so what Desikachar said to me back in the maybe after 3 months I had been there, that he said, "Don't think you know what you know." This is more or less a quote that I'll never forget. "Don't think you know about yoga from what you've learned from me." And I had no idea what he was talking about. And he called me a brasta, a yoga brasta, which is not exactly a compliment. It sort of means a fallen yogi. So I said, "What do you mean?" He said that you have been doing this many lifetimes and you died before you completed your journey, so you had to come back. So, this is like a deep samskara, or even deeper vasana in me, that this orientation to this work. And in religious studies, I was one of those sort of long-haired students who didn't do much study but got all A's. In religious studies, I was sort of a natural in that field of religious studies. So I don't know why, it just seemed to be what happened to me.
Sometimes life just puts us that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a mystery, isn't it?
Yeah, and so how do you get...
For me, this is an issue of dharma and svadharma, really. And I feel lucky that life just brought me to great teachers, and many great teachers, actually, that have enabled me to find a way of living in svadharma.
So how did you get from Patanjali to Desikachar?
Well, as I said, and if you want, I'll give you a little detail about it, just a moment. There was a professor named Kenneth Morgan, and he was an extraordinary professor, on a sort of national or world level, actually. He was originally from Harvard, and he was one of the first guys that studied what they would call a religion other than one's own. If he were alive today, he would be over 100. So he was an older guy and one of the first academics. So he went to India and Asia and also into the Islamic world, and he created 3 separate books that he did the outline, and then he contracted with great scholars from each of their own traditions to do different chapters. So the path of the Buddha, the way of the Hindu, and Islam. And these 3 books were like my introduction to religious studies through Ken Morgan. And Kenneth Morgan lived in Madras for a certain period of time, and he encouraged Mary Lou Skelton, who was this wife of the head of the music department to go with her husband to India and meet Krishnamacharya. So Kenneth Morgan knew about Krishnamacharya, and actually really through a guy named Albert Franklin, who was a consulate general in Madras, and he's a politician guy. So he knew Krishnamacharya, and then Mary Lou went and met Albert Franklin through Kenneth Morgan's contacts, and then through that met Krishnamacharya. So the way I went from Patanjali, Kenneth Morgan was my teacher. I took the yoga class. Kenneth Morgan and Mary Lou Skelton were friends. Kenneth Morgan said to Mary Lou that this guy is a good student of religion, so they invited me to go to study yoga. I hope that's not confusing.
No, it's not confusing at all. And I got a little bit of that, actually. Chase Bossart came on years ago, and he talked a little bit about being at Colgate and the program that brought him out to India as well.
Correct. So, Chase and I did it 15 years before Chase did, of course.
Right.
But we did that same kind of link. And then ironically or funny is that I went to graduate school at UC, University of California, Santa Barbara, in the religious studies department, and so did Chase. Again, so we went Colgate, India, UC Santa Barbara. We have that in common, 15 years apart.
Yeah, well, he spoke about how changing his meeting Desikachar was, and I know it was the same for you. Did you meet him first in India? Because I also know that he was brought here to Colgate University, or did that happen later?
That happened later. In fact, I was one of the... So what happened was I met him in 1974. He had not been to the United States. And Mary Lou Skelton was a student of Krishnamacharya, but he was quite old at that point, and he stopped teaching Westerners. And so he asked her to study with Desikachar. So me and Mary Lou went out on this study group in 1974, and Mary Lou had this idea of doing a January program that's a 1-month immersion. That was something that still goes on at Colgate University, that students can do different programs. And so she invited Desikachar to come to Colgate. There was a center called Chapel House. This all ties together, which Kenneth Morgan was the creator of. And it's just a sort of non-denominational, non-sectarian sort of place that you can stay. It's got a religious library and books and music and art, and there's rooms that you can stay there, and there's a chapel or a meditation hall. And so Desikachar came in 1976, and I was there was about 10 students for a month, and that was when he did the lectures that then I took and edited, did the initial editing of the transcripts, and then Mary Lou and the religious studies professor published as Religiousness in Yoga, which then became the Heart of Yoga. So that study group at Colgate in 1976 was the source of the book, The Heart of Yoga. Mm-hmm. And so I met Desikachar in India and was, one of the first people that studied with him in the United States when he came in 1976.
And to your remembrance, what was yoga like in 1976 in the West? Like, from what I know, there wasn't a lot. Like, people didn't really know much about it.
There was Richard Hittleman and Lily Has Fallen.
Right.
Kind of Richard Hittleman and Lily Has Fallen, and not much else. And sort of at the same time, Mr. Iyengar came to the United States. Rama Vernon invited him. I don't remember the exact year, but it was the sort of Iyengar came to the West. And so as I was in Madras learning yoga, Krishnamacharya's yoga via Iyengar, which was different, of course, was beginning to grow in the West. So there was just a beginning of yoga in the West, and it was still mostly oriented towards, the asana practice. At the same time, there was Maharishi, and transcendental meditation was emerging as well. So but they weren't integrated. There was the emergence of the asana-centric yoga, which then became very popularized by Mr. Iyengar. And then there was some, I don't remember when Swami Satchidananda came to the United States, but maybe in the late 60s. So his movement was beginning as well, but they were just all in the sort of beginning phase.
Yeah, I've heard people speak about that, like coming out of the 60s and seeing the Beatles go to India. Like, a lot of people were looking for gurus.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me, though, that you also weren't necessarily like in North America. You were in Hawaii doing yoga therapy. which...
Well, this was, so I went to India in 74 when I was a student at Colgate. I had not yet been to Hawaii. Then in 76, I graduated, went to Hawaii for my brother's wedding, and my family moved there. And I was just there for a couple months. Then I went back to India for 2 years, 76 to 78. So when I came back in 1978, I went to graduate school in Santa Barbara, and then I left that program in 79. I was in a PhD track. That's another story.
Yeah.
In 79, I left and came and moved in Maui, and in, I think, 80, started teaching in 1980s when I probably formally started teaching in Maui.
And I'm curious because I'm very intrigued by Desikachar. I never met him personally, but all of the people that I've ever learned about or heard about in yoga, he's by far the most inspirational. And that event, Kripalu, really brought it home for me. And one of the things that I think is most signature about it is that he had this interpersonal relationship aspect to the yoga between the teacher and the student. And I've heard you speak about that some, about him telling you to work one-to-one and you opening that place in Hawaii. And I'm curious if that was also your experience, like comparatively to other approaches, the kind of way that he called you friends and the way that he related to people and dealt with people on a one-to-one basis seemed to me to be something unique from other approaches.
You know, it's hard for me back then to compare with anything else because I had no yoga, and then Mary Lou Skelton, who was a longtime student of Krishnamacharya, she didn't become a student of Desikachar until the same year I did because she was with Krishnamacharya prior to that. And so when I began learning, what was happening was the group sessions were on chanting and on study of texts, like Yoga Sutras or some of the Upanishads that I studied, or Bhagavad Gita. But the asana, pranayama, meditation practices were always done individually. And so that was how I learned that yoga needs to be adapted to meet the needs and interests of the students or the practitioners. And so I was taught individually. And so when I began teaching the way I was taught, which is private classes. And it was only after several years that I was encouraged to do, by Desikachar, to train teachers and to do some group classes. And so Desikachar used to always say that, you know, the root of the word yoga is yuj, which means you can say to link or to connect. And he used that to say that it's in teacher-student relationship, it's relationship, and it's about quality of connection. He said even about in the practices, asana is you establishing a relationship with your self, with your structure, for example, through the spine, and pranayama, you experiencing a relationship to your autonomic nervous system via your breath, and even meditation, relationship with your mind via attention. So in a student-teacher relationship, again, it's all about relationship and establishing, all of yoga is about relationship, he would say. So it's about establishing quality relationship with yourself at a multidimensional level, and as a teacher with your students, which means observing them, paying attention to them, understanding what their needs and interests are, caring for them in that way. So it's the same model of relationship, whether we're talking about asana, pranayama, or meditation, or we're talking about teaching. And he modeled that very well.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of his teaching was by example. He embodied these things that he was teaching in a way that communicated it in gesture and beyond just words.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. He was authentically himself. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we have these events like at Kripalu, we presented just the heaven, but it wasn't only heaven there. Sometimes the methods of teaching were challenging, and in a way, in the modern world, especially with all of the political correctness and so forth in academia, people wouldn't tolerate it today. The traditional method of teaching, which is how Desikachar, although he was a modern man, he still followed that method, was strict and sometimes maybe with good intention, deep, compassionate intention, sometimes the teaching method was through pain. I don't mean physical abuse at all, but I mean, strong teaching is often very uncomfortable.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I've remarked that when I first got to yoga, and it was like in the early 90s, it was still the case that like you really had to sort of prove that you were a determined student more. Like it wasn't so much like I pay and now you give me the yoga, like teachers wouldn't teach you unless you demonstrated that you were serious,
Serious and threw up obstacles, and then also in Desikachar's method, he only would give you information or knowledge that he thought you could understand, or that he thought you were able to integrate and utilize. So, for example, some of us got teachings that others of us didn't get. It's kind of, I joked at the Kripalu event that what's done in Vegas stays in Vegas, or whatever that expression is. Yeah. Kind of the unique relationship with the teacher like Desikachar that we all had was different, not comparable to the relationship we had with others. So how, for example, Larry, we were at Kripalu, so Larry or Richard had a very different relationship with Desikachar than me. Mm-hmm. What I learned was different than what a lot of other people learned. And part of it was because, in my case, because I was just...
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.